They thought she was just a lost old woman. When Margaret Lane slowly walked into the backstage area of America's Spotlight, a worn cream shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, and a pair of old silver ballet slippers tied with pale pink ribbons. On her feet, a young staffer quickly whispered to a colleague, "Let's put this lady at the top of the show." Audiences love those gentle, touching acts. They called it a human moment, a sweet little performance to tug at heartstrings, then be quietly eliminated. But no one in the studio that afternoon knew that Margaret Lane had once been a blazing star on the world's grandest stages, until an injury silenced her forever. Nearly 5 decades had passed since the last time she danced. Before we continue, Margaret Lane's moving journey. If you believe that passion never truly fades, that no matter how many years go by, the soul of an artist can still shine, please like and subscribe to help share more beautiful and hopeful stories like this with the world. Now, let's return to the story, where every step may change the way we see age, art, and ourselves. That morning, in a quiet town in Bend, Oregon, Margaret stood by the window of her second-floor apartment, looking out at the misty view. Late autumn leaves fell silently outside, and within, the room held the ticking of a wall clock, a cooling cup of tea and a pair of ballet shoes neatly placed beneath the table, the one thing she could never let go of. At 74, Margaret's life moved at a gentle pace, filled with classical music from the radio, breakfasts with peanut butter, and afternoons spent restitching the lining of her old robe. She was a widow, a loving grandmother, a quiet neighbor, and once a dancer known as the lightest wing of the New York Ballet, a title no one at today's show had ever heard of. A sudden phone call from her 19-year-old granddaughter, Emily, set everything in motion. "Grandma, I just sent in that video of you dancing at the church last Christmas to America's Spotlight. They want to invite you to perform." Margaret nearly dropped her teacup. "You, what?" she gasped. "I never thought I'd perform again." "But you still dance every night, even if it's just in the living room," Emily softly replied. "I've seen your eyes when that music plays. I believe you still carry something the world needs." To see. Margaret looked toward the old record player. A vinyl of Clair de Lune was slowly spinning. It was the song she and her husband, Daniel, had played each evening in their small living room, where she would dance for him after the accident that stole her stage. Daniel had passed away in 2004. Since then, Margaret had never danced in front of anyone. That evening, Margaret opened her old wooden wardrobe. In the bottom drawer was a cream-colored ballet dress, kept safe for nearly half a century. It had yellowed with time, but still carried the memories. The scent of powder, the soft tap of shoes on wood, and the applause that once gave life to a young girl's dreams. She tried the dress on. The mirror reflected a woman with silver hair tied in a neat bun, a body no longer agile, but eyes that still held the same spark. Margaret lifted one arm, tilted her head, and began to slowly turn. What many don't realize, those who once danced never truly stopped dancing. 3 days later, Margaret stood at the airport holding a small suitcase and a wooden music box, a wedding gift from Daniel. It still played the opening notes of Clair de Lune every time she opened the lid. In her suitcase were the old ballet dress, silver slippers, and a sheet of paper with the title of her music, Clair de Lune, Debussy. When she arrived in Los Angeles, the city swirled with lights and noise. A young assistant named Jessa came to pick her up. "Ms. Margaret Lane, I'll take you to the hotel, first of this year's inspiring stories," she said without looking up from her phone. Margaret simply nodded, saying nothing. She recognized that look. She had seen it in people's eyes 40 years ago when they told her, "You can't dance anymore. You should rest now." But today, she wasn't here to prove anything to anyone else. She came to remind herself the fire had never gone out. The recording center of America's Spotlight was a 4-story building nestled in the bustling heart of downtown, its glass facade reflecting the golden afternoon sun like a stage of its own. As Margaret stepped through the automatic doors, her hand lightly resting on the railing, She felt as though she'd entered a completely foreign world, a place where 20-something dreams collided in every direction, where people rushed, frantic and breathless, as if tomorrow wouldn't come unless they made it on camera today. The contestant lounge was an open space lined with glossy white leather chairs, mirrors for makeup at every corner, and clusters of young people doing vocal warm-ups, stretching, applying dramatic makeup, all chasing one thing: opportunity. In the middle of it all, Margaret looked completely out of place, a small elderly woman with sun-spotted skin, cradling a music box and her ballet dress wrapped in a white fabric. A young woman with fiery red hair and neon green sneakers plopped down beside Margaret. "I'm Kayla. So who are you in the cast? The MC's grandma?" she joked, half serious, half teasing. Margaret smiled, eyes still on the sheet of paper in her hand. "I'm a contestant." Kayla raised an eyebrow. "Really? What are you gonna do? Read poetry? Tell stories from back in the day?" Margaret softly replied, "I'm going to dance." The answer silenced Kayla for a few seconds. Then she gave a small laugh. "That's kinda cool, though honestly I think they're just trying to make people cry. Like invite someone super emotional and then eliminate them fast. I used to work backstage for this show. They call it a SE, sympathetic elimination." Margaret didn't react. She was used to comments that carried the sting of pity wrapped in politeness. The way people looked at her with gentle eyes but no belief. The way they called her brave instead of gifted. A little while later, when a coordinator called Margaret in for hair and makeup, Kayla suddenly turned toward her again. "Anyway, if you really are going to dance, dance for yourself. Not for them, because they'll never truly get it." The makeup room smelled of powder, soft perfume, and the click of brushes and combs. A makeup artist named Leo, with platinum, blonde hair and runway chic style, gently dabbed blush onto Margaret's cheeks. "You want to keep it natural, right?" he asked gently. "Nothing flashy. Just enough so the lights don't swallow your face." Margaret nodded. "Just me as I am." When she looked in the mirror, she saw a face both strange and familiar. Still Margaret Lane, the one who taught dance at the community center, the wife who spent her youth caring for a chronically ill husband. But beneath those eyes was also the girl who once stood on the stage of the New York Grand Theater, who had spun in light before thousands, and who collapsed after a single wrong. Turn shattered the cartilage in her knee forever. After that injury, she left the stage. No tears, no farewell performance. Just one final packing of the shoes and a quiet step into real life, with a teaching degree and a heart that never stopped dancing in silence. When the loudspeaker called out, "Contestant Margaret Lane, 15 minutes to stage," she took a deep breath and opened the music box. Clair de Lune floated out like a promise. That melody had once brought Daniel home after every workday. It had been the music for a dance meant for him alone. Gentle, no stage, no audience, only love. She changed into her dress. The old silk brushed lightly against her skin, still soft. As the first day, the stitched repairs, the faded yellow along the hem, they all stood as evidence of a life not glamorous, but real. Before stepping into the corridor that led to the stage, she unlocked her phone, the smartphone Emily had just taught her to use. A message lit the screen. "I'll be in the second row, left corner. I believe in you." Margaret smiled. She didn't need the world to applaud. She just needed one person to believe in her, like Daniel once did. And this time, she wouldn't dance to reclaim the past. She would dance to affirm the fire had never gone out. It had only been waiting for the right moment to ignite once more, even if just one last time. The hallway leading to the stage was longer than Margaret had imagined. Each step on the carpeted floor echoed faintly, like the sound of her own heartbeat at that moment. Along the walls hung photos of previous contestants, young, radiant faces filled with hunger and hope. She didn't belong here. And yet, strangely, she wasn't afraid. A stagehand wearing a headset and holding a clipboard stood by the wings. "Ms. Margaret Lane," he checked. "We're going to introduce you as a former dance teacher from Oregon, all right?" A little emotional touch for the audience. Margaret simply smiled without answering. She knew what they expected. A tearful old lady, a few emotional sniffles, then a trembling pirouette for dramatic effect. They called it a human interest segment, but they didn't know that the woman standing here had once trained with masters, practiced thousands of hours for a single movement, and turned the world's biggest stages into places where she told stories with the language of the body. From afar, the host's voice rang out, familiar, dramatic. Up next, a very special contestant, 74 years old, a former dance teacher. Performing for the first time on national television, please welcome Ms. Margaret Lane. A polite round of applause followed, not enthusiastic, not mocking, just simple courtesy. As Margaret stepped onto the stage, the spotlight hit her directly, and her eyes took a few seconds to adjust. She couldn't make out the audience's faces, but she could feel their attention, tense, expectant, and tinged with doubt. At the judges' table, 3 figures sat upright: a young pop star who had once been a professional dancer, a legendary silver-haired choreographer, and a famous stage actress known for her sharp critiques. All 3 gazed at her like one might study a sheet of music before hearing the first note. Ms. Lane, the eldest judge spoke, voice calm and deliberate. What will you be performing today? Margaret stood tall. I will dance, not to compete, but to remember who I once was. A few murmurs rose in the crowd, but the judge nodded. To what music? Clair de Lune. The version my husband loved, the audio technician signaled. The lights softened, and the sound of piano began. Slow, gentle, like drops of dew falling on a lake. At first, Margaret didn't move. She stood still, head slightly bowed, arms resting at her sides. But as the first chords unfurled, her body began to respond. There were no fast spins like in her youth, no high leaps. But each step, each arm movement, each tilt of the head was as precise as a wordless poem. The audience grew silent. The quiet deepened with each passing note. No one was looking for technique anymore. They saw only a woman, silver-haired in a pale cream dress, telling a story with her entire life. As the music swelled, Margaret lifted one leg into a simple arabesque, but her outstretched arms seemed to embrace someone invisible. Maybe it was Daniel. Maybe it was her 20-year-old self, with dreams still whole. Emily, her granddaughter, sat below, hands clenched, eyes glistening. A young woman beside her whispered, "That girl's crying. Is that her grandma?" Emily didn't respond. She just stared, unblinking. And then, as the final note faded, Margaret closed the dance with a traditional dancer's bow. Nothing flashy, nothing theatrical, just the quiet conclusion of someone who had carefully tidied the room of her memories. No one clapped immediately. 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then a single clap rang out from a corner of the room. Then 2, then 10. And like a rising wave, the entire hall stood up, applause crashing like a storm. Not for a flawless performance, but for a truth that couldn't be imitated. At the judges' table, the silver-haired choreographer turned to the host. She didn't come here to compete. She came to remind us why we ever loved to dance. The backstage area after the performance was an entirely different world. People often say stage lights blur out reality, but it's only when stepping out of that glow that you truly see what you've left behind. Margaret sat quietly on a metal chair draped in a white cloth, her hands resting gently on her lap, her heart still trembling like the surface of a pond after a stone is dropped. No one said anything to her right away. They didn't have to. The looks they exchanged were enough. The backstage crew, who had earlier eyed her with thinly veiled pity, now nodded at her like she was a true artist. Zoe, the red-haired girl who had once sat next to her in the waiting room, appeared with tear-streaked eyes. I didn't think. You'd be the one to make me cry? Margaret gave a soft laugh. I didn't think I had it in me either. Zoe crouched down beside her. It wasn't because you're older, or because of some touching story. It was every movement you made, they were real. Like each motion was an apology, a promise, a memory. Margaret remained quiet for a moment, then nodded gently. You? No, I used to think I had nothing left to give, but maybe the things we keep hidden the longest are the ones most worth sharing. Just an hour later, the show's media office was flooded with thousands of comments from viewers. A video clip of Margaret's performance was uploaded to the show's official social media account, and within just 45 minutes, it had surpassed 1 million views. In a modest hotel near the studio, Emily and Margaret sat side by side, their phones glowing with a cascade of notifications. "Grandma, people are calling you the breath of time." One article says Margaret Lane doesn't dance. She tells stories with every aging muscle still capable of loving. Margaret placed her hand over her granddaughter's. "But I don't need a title," Emily smiled. "But you deserve a voice." That evening, Ryan Matthews, the show's executive producer, personally knocked on their door. In his hand was an envelope and a bouquet of white orchids. "Ms. Lane," he began, his voice deeper than usual, "I have to admit, we misjudged you, and I personally apologize for putting SE next to your name. But today you didn't just confuse us. You reminded us why art exists." Margaret looked at him, her eyes kind yet steady. "I'm not angry. I've grown used to being underestimated. The hardest part isn't proving others wrong. It's overcoming the doubt inside yourself." Ryan handed her the envelope. 3 art institutes have sent invitations for you to speak. One of them is offering you a position to teach dance classes for older performers. And someone special also asked me to pass along a note. Margaret unfolded a small piece of paper tucked behind the main letter. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blue. "Margaret, I watched your performance. I should have told you years ago. You carry the gentlest flame I've ever seen, but I stayed silent. I was wrong, and I regret it. Charles Hemmings." She froze. Charles Hemmings, the instructor who once said she lacked emotion, had no voice during her final evaluation at the Arts Academy. His cold judgment had driven Margaret away from the stage, into teaching, and kept her from stepping into the spotlight ever again. Until today. Emily read the name aloud. Is that the man who made you stop dancing?" Margaret nodded, but her eyes held no anger now. "Maybe. He's carried that weight his whole life, too." That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She stood by the hotel window, gazing out at the city lights. In her hands was the music box, still, playing the gentle strains of Clair de Lune, like a lullaby. She turned softly in place, performing an old pas de bourrée. Not for anyone to see, not to prove anything. Simply because her body still remembered and her heart still loved. 1 week after the performance, Margaret returned to the small town of Bend, Oregon, where the streets were still peaceful. The leaves still fell in quiet rhythm, and neighbors still left warm toast on doorsteps like a tender ritual. But something had changed forever. Margaret was no longer the old lady Lane who lives alone on the 2nd floor. The girl at the bookstore whispered, "I've watched you on YouTube 3 times already." The delivery man hesitantly asked for her autograph. An elderly couple waited on her porch just to say thank you. "You made us remember the last time we danced together. Thank you for that." Margaret always smiled, but within, she kept her usual calm. She had never sought fame. What she needed came the moment that audience rose to its feet, not because she was a brave old woman, but because they saw themselves in each of her steps, the regrets, the lost love, the dreams long buried. That evening, Margaret opened the wooden box in her drawer, where she kept the letters Daniel had written during his cancer treatment. One letter had never been read because the day it arrived he had passed. If one day you return to the stage, don't do it for anyone. Don't do it for applause. Do it because you still have something to say. For you, dancing was never about technique. It was how you breathed. "And I'll always be in the front row, even if no one else sees." She folded the letter, then stood. Her silver ballet shoes still rested neatly beside the dresser. But this time she didn't need to put them on. She simply opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and began to spin gently. The night air was calm. A breeze carried the scent of lavender from the neighbor's garden. No one was watching, no cameras. Just her, and the feeling that she was no longer dancing for the past but for her present. A month later, Margaret received invitations from 3 art institutions to teach dance to people over 60. One of them was at the very academy where Charles Hemmings had once extinguished her dream. Attached to the offer was a handwritten note. "I've watched your performance over and over. In it, I saw everything I've searched for my entire career. Truth. If you're willing, please come. This time, I will be the one learning." Margaret stared at the note for a long while. Then she placed it on the table and called out to Emily. "What do you think about starting a small class at the community center this summer?" Emily's eyes lit up. "You want to teach again?" Margaret shook her head gently. "Not teach, just dance together, to remind those who think it's too late, that we still have the right to be beautiful, to live, to move in our own way." On opening day, more than 30 people arrived, some with walking canes, some once diagnosed with Parkinson's, and even an 82-year-old man who asked to enroll in honor of his late wife. Margaret entered the large mirrored room in a simple, beige dress and smiled. "No one here is performing to compete. We're here because we can still feel the music, and as long as we can feel, we can dance." There was no stage, no judges, but when Clair de Lune played from the old Bluetooth speaker, the whole room seemed to melt. Awkward steps, laughter, shaky arms reaching skyward, and in the middle of it all, Margaret spun, light as the wind, deep as a lifetime. And in the golden afternoon light shining through the tall windows, some say that if you looked closely, you'd see the shadow of a man sitting in the front row, a teacup in hand, smiling. Yes, Daniel never really left. So the story of Margaret Lane comes to a close, a journey of rising from memory, reminding the world that art knows no age. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe so we can continue bringing more deeply human, moving, and inspiring stories like this one. See you on the next journey.